In the quiet countryside town, Selina had found her only companion in a golden retriever named Dodo. He was more than just a pet to her. He was her shadow, her joy, and the one bright spot in her otherwise solitary life. Dodo's playful energy was infectious, lighting up every corner of her small home. He'd follow her everywhere, from the bedroom to the kitchen, padding along with his soft paws and bright eyes. His tail wagged like a clock's rhythm, full of affection and endless loyalty. When Selina returned from the coffee shop every evening, Dodo was always there, waiting at the gate with a wagging tail and eyes that glowed with joy, as if he'd waited every second just for her. One night, Selina was jolted awake by the sharp, urgent sound of Dodo's barking from the garden. This was odd. Dodo was never one to bark in the middle of the night, especially not in such an intense way. For a moment, she lay there, listening, her mind still wrapped in the fog of sleep. But Dodo's barking was insistent, and the urgency in his voice made her heart beat faster. She pulled herself out of bed, slipping on her slippers, and walked through the darkened house to the garden. The shadows seemed longer than usual, stretching across the walls in strange shapes. She pushed open the back door and stepped outside, finding Dodo standing near the garden's edge. His eyes were locked on a point in the darkness, his fur raised and his barking was louder now, almost desperate. But when Selina squinted into the shadows, she saw nothing, only Dodo, barking fiercely at what? There was no one there, not a person, not an animal, nothing to explain his sudden change. "Dodo?" she called softly, hoping her voice would soothe him. "What's wrong, boy? Come inside." But Dodo didn't turn. He stood rooted in place, his gaze unbroken, his growling low and throaty. When she reached out and touched him, he finally stopped barking. Slowly, Dodo turned his head, his gaze falling on her. But the way he looked at her made her freeze. His eyes, usually warm and familiar, were cold and unrecognizing. It was as if he didn't know her, like he was staring at a stranger. There was no wagging of his tail, no flicker of recognition, just a steady, blank look that made her feel as though he was seeing her for the first time. "Dodo, it's me," she whispered, unsure of what else to say. But Dodo continued to stare, tilting his head slightly, as though he was trying to understand who she was. Her hand wavered as she held it out to him, hoping for any sign of his usual self. A sliver of doubt crept into her mind, twisting her thoughts into uneasy shapes. But then, after what felt like an eternity, his eyes softened, and that spark of recognition she knew so well returned. His tail gave a tentative wag, and he stepped closer, nuzzling her hand in the familiar way he always did. Selina breathed a sigh of relief, brushing off her own discomfort. "Come on, boy. Let's get back to bed." With a gentle tug, she led him inside, watching as he padded along beside her as if nothing unusual had happened. They returned to the bedroom, and as she lay down with Dodo curled up beside her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Dodo was back to his usual self, his breathing soft and calm, his tail thumping against the bed in that familiar rhythm. But that strange moment in the garden lingered in her mind, and as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't help but wonder. What had Dodo seen in the darkness? And why, for that brief, unsettling moment, had he looked at her as if he didn't know her at all? In the days that followed, Dodo's behavior began to shift, little by little, in ways that Selina couldn't quite put her finger on at first. It was small things, little oddities that, when taken alone, might have been nothing, but together they began to form a picture that made her uneasy. Dodo, once her constant shadow, now seemed to prefer his own space. When she walked from the kitchen to the living room, he didn't follow her with his usual cheerful steps. Instead, he stayed behind, sitting in a corner with an unsettling stillness, his eyes fixed on her. She'd catch him watching her from across the room, his gaze unwavering and almost calculating. His once friendly tail, always wagging in delight, had stopped moving altogether. The silence of it felt strange, as if the house itself were holding its breath. "Dodo?" she would call to him gently, crouching down and patting her lap, hoping to coax him back to his old self. But Dodo only stared back, his head tilted ever so slightly, his eyes dark and watchful. When he finally did move, it was slow, cautious, as though he were sizing her up. Selina tried not to read too much into it, to brush off the unease that had begun to gnaw at her, but each day seemed to bring a deeper distance between them. In the evenings, when she returned home from the coffee shop, Dodo no longer greeted her at the door. He'd stopped waiting for her by the gate, his tail wagging with excitement, his eyes bright and eager. Instead, she would find him sitting alone, watching her from a distance as she entered the house. His tail remained still, and his gaze was strange, almost expectant, as if he were waiting for something she didn't understand. Selina missed the warmth of his usual welcome, the joy he'd always brought to her home. She tried everything she could think of to bring him back to his old self. She bought his favorite treats, knelt down to play with his toys, even tried calling him with the playful tone that used to make him bounce with excitement. But nothing seemed to reach him. Dodo would only watch, his eyes sharp and focused, barely blinking, as if studying her with a strange intensity. "Come here, boy," she said one evening, her voice edged with worry. She reached out to him, her hand hesitating in midair, but Dodo just sat there, unmoving, his head tilted slightly as he looked at her with an expression that was almost unfamiliar. He seemed like a stranger, his eyes filled with a silent question she couldn't answer. The silence in the house grew thicker each night. She missed the way he used to curl up by her side, the way he'd press his warm body against her as she fell asleep. Now he kept his distance, often watching her from the corner of the room, his gaze following her every move. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night to find him sitting by the door, staring at her with that same intense look, his body rigid and tense. She couldn't help but feel a chill settle over her as his eyes tracked her every movement, silent and unblinking, as though he were waiting for something. One evening, desperate to bring him back, she knelt down and opened her arms wide, calling him with all the warmth she could muster. "Dodo, please come here," she pleaded, her voice almost a whisper. But he didn't move. Instead, he just watched her, his head lowered slightly, his eyes dark and unreadable. It was as if he didn't recognize her anymore, or maybe he did, but was somehow different himself. Selina sat back on her heels, a sense of helplessness creeping over her. The warmth that had once filled her small home felt hollow now, replaced by a cold, watching silence. She had always thought of Dodo as her loyal companion, her friend in an otherwise lonely world. But now, as she looked into his unfamiliar gaze, she felt a strange, sinking feeling that she couldn't quite shake. And Dodo continued to sit there, his eyes locked on hers, waiting. One evening, determined to reach the old Dodo she missed, Selina knelt down beside him. She looked into his eyes, hoping for a glimmer of the warmth she'd known so well. "Dodo," she murmured, her voice gentle and full of longing. "What's wrong, boy? It's me." For a brief moment, his head tilted, and she thought she caught a trace of recognition. But then something flickered in his gaze, an icy spark that hadn't been there before. His lips curled back, exposing his teeth, and a low, guttural growl escaped his throat. Selina froze, her eyes wide with shock. Dodo had never growled at her, never shown anything close to aggression. "Dodo," she whispered, inching backward, her heart suddenly heavy with dread. But before she could take another step, Dodo lunged at her. She stumbled, crashing into the edge of the table, scrambling to push herself away. The Dodo she knew was gone, replaced by something wild and relentless. He leapt forward, snapping at her arm, his jaws closing inches from her skin. Selina managed to pull her arm back just in time, her eyes locked on his face, and for the first time, she noticed something chilling. His eyes. They had turned sharp, intense, almost yellow, like the eyes of a wolf. The familiar, gentle gaze was gone, replaced by something feral and strange. Her heart raced, panic filling her as she realized that the creature in front of her was no longer her Dodo. It was something else, something that had taken hold of him. As Dodo snarled, his body tensed, preparing to strike again. Selina's mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening. She reached a hand out, trying to calm him, but he snapped at it, his teeth grazing her fingertips. Fear surged through her, and she took a step back, hoping to create some distance. But Dodo didn't stop. He lunged again, forcing her to backpedal until she was cornered against the wall. Then, just as he bared his teeth and lunged at her neck, something in his body seemed to shift. His attack halted midair, and he stumbled slightly, his body trembling as if struggling against an invisible force. His breathing grew ragged, his muscles tense as though he were caught in a battle within himself. She could see it in his eyes, that flash of conflict. Part of him wanted to stop, to resist, as if he were trapped inside his own body. "Dodo," she whispered, barely able to find her voice. "Please, I know you're in there." For a moment, his eyes softened, the sharpness fading just a little. His head dipped, his body tense but held back, like he was fighting against something unseen. His gaze wavered, caught between aggression and confusion, his face contorted in pain. It was as if he knew, deep down, the horror of what he was about to do. He looked at her with a mix of regret and desperation, his gaze pleading for help, his body shivering as if under a spell he was struggling to break. Then, with one last, shuddering breath, Dodo backed away, his body sagging as if exhausted by the struggle. His wolf-like eyes lingered on her, flickering with the familiar warmth she recognized, and for a brief second, Selina felt a flicker of hope. But even as he looked at her, his gaze remained conflicted, torn between loyalty and something far darker. Dodo stood there, frozen, his wild eyes still watching her, and Selina realized that whatever had taken hold of him was not yet done. Dodo lowered his head, his tail drooping between his legs, a shadow of shame casting over his entire body. He wouldn't look at Selina. His eyes, once so full of trust and joy, flickered briefly with a deep sadness, as if he understood the weight of what he had almost done, of the fear he had put in her heart. With a final hesitant glance back, his gaze lingered on her, soft and pained, almost like an apology. Then, as if unable to bear her gaze any longer, he turned slowly toward the front gate and walked away, each step heavy, reluctant, like he was leaving a piece of himself behind. Selina felt an ache rise in her chest as she watched him go, a mix of worry, sadness, and fear gnawing inside her. She hesitated, her feet glued to the floor, torn between the memory of her loving Dodo and the strange creature he had become. But something urged her forward, a quiet need to understand, to know what had changed in him. She couldn't abandon him, not like this. Slowly, she stepped forward, careful to keep her distance, yet close enough that he remained in her sight. She followed him down the quiet streets, keeping a steady distance. She kept her footsteps light, her breath shallow, not wanting to alert him or provoke another attack. Dodo walked with his head down, his posture tense and subdued, as if carrying a burden only he could feel. The setting sun cast long shadows on the ground, stretching across the empty street as they made their way toward the forest that lay on the edge of town. Dusk had already begun to settle as they neared the forest, the trees looming darkly against the fading light. Selina felt her stomach tighten. She had never seen Dodo like this, so lost and distant, and a growing unease settled in her as he continued deeper into the woods. She kept her distance, her eyes focused on his form, her steps cautious. The trees cast twisted shadows, and the leaves rustled softly as if whispering secrets she wasn't meant to hear. Dodo paused once at the edge of the forest, his body tense, his gaze shifting toward her one last time. His eyes held a strange, haunted look, a mix of regret and something darker, something that seemed to pull him forward against his own will. He held her gaze for a long, silent moment, and Selina felt a pang of grief, sensing that he was saying goodbye. Then he turned and slipped into the shadows of the forest, his figure melting into the darkness. Selina followed, her own steps uncertain, fear prickling at her skin as she tried to keep him in sight. But the forest was dense, the trees thick with shadows that seemed to swallow the last traces of daylight. She quickened her pace, straining her eyes to catch a glimpse of him, her heart sinking as she realized he was slipping further and further away. The sound of his footsteps faded, and in the growing darkness, she lost him. Selina stopped, her eyes scanning the thickening shadows, her voice trembling as she called out, "Dodo!" But there was no answer, only the quiet rustling of leaves and the soft, eerie hush of the forest around her. Selina stood in the forest's shadows, her eyes searching for Dodo. The silence around her was unsettling, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. The deeper she went, the darker and denser the woods became, the trees close-knit and towering above her, their branches twisting together to block out what little light remained. Shadows loomed in every direction, and her skin prickled with an instinctive sense that she was too far in. She had stepped beyond where she should have, and now the forest seemed to press in around her, closing her off from the outside world. A sudden, low growl echoed through the trees, chilling the air. Selina's breath caught, her face paling as her wide eyes darted around, trying to locate the source. Her mouth felt dry, her hands trembling slightly. She instinctively took a step backward, her mind racing with the realization that she wasn't alone, and whatever was nearby was no ordinary creature. Then, in the corner of her vision, she spotted a figure. She turned and gasped. It was Dodo, but there was something strange, something off about the way he stood, his body tense, his eyes glowing with that eerie, wolf-like glint. He was crouched low, his gaze locked on something beyond her. Just as she took a shaky step back, Dodo did something that defied everything she knew. Without hesitation, he bounded toward a nearby tree, a towering, ancient thing with thick, twisted branches, and leapt at it with a grace she had never seen in him. His paws latched onto the bark, and he climbed, swiftly and skillfully, scaling the tree like a seasoned predator. Selina stared, her mouth open in shock, struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. Dodo, a dog, was climbing a tree, his limbs moving with the ease of a wolf, his muscles flexing as he ascended. She watched as he reached a high branch, his eyes still fixed ahead with a fierce intensity. This was no accident. This was instinct, a skill that no dog should possess. Selina stood below the tree, looking up at Dodo in confusion and sadness. He perched on a high branch, almost 25 feet up, his eyes watching her with a look she could hardly understand. It was Dodo, her playful, devoted friend, but he seemed different. For a brief moment, his gaze softened, as if to say he was sorry. Selina's heart sank as she reached out instinctively, calling up to him. "Dodo, please, come back down." Dodo held her gaze, a quiet resolve in his expression. It was almost as though he knew something she didn't, like a gentle goodbye, a look filled with the loyalty she'd always known. Selina's breath hitched, and she took a step forward, reaching for him even though she knew she couldn't close the distance. Dodo, please." Dodo turned toward the edge of the branch, the wood bending slightly beneath him. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, glancing back at her as if to assure her of his love, of his loyalty to her, then took a small step forward. Selina watched, her voice catching in her throat as he leapt down from the branch, falling swiftly to the ground. "No!" she called, rushing forward, her mind racing. She reached his side as he lay still, brushing her hand across his fur, hoping to find some spark of the friend she knew. Tears filled her eyes as she knelt beside him, overcome with the painful realization that he was gone. In the silence, Selina gently held him, remembering his unfailing love, his loyalty, and his gentle spirit. She stayed by his side until the early morning light began to filter through the trees, casting a soft glow over them. Eventually, she carried Dodo back to a quiet spot beneath an old oak tree, where she laid him to rest. Though her heart ached, Selina found comfort in knowing that Dodo's love for her would always remain, a bond she would carry with her forever. Even as she returned home, the warmth of his memory stayed with her, filling the empty spaces with gratitude for the friend who had shown her the truest kind of love. Late one night, as Selina lay in bed, a faint, familiar sound drifted through her window, a soft, low howl, echoing through the quiet night. It was close, right outside, near her gate. She sat up, her chest tightening as she recognized the sound. A part of her wanted to dismiss it, to convince herself it was just her imagination. But something in that howl pulled at her, and she found herself walking toward the window, her heart filled with both hope and caution. Peering through the glass, she froze. There, sitting patiently by the gate, was a golden retriever, his fur catching the moonlight in a warm, golden glow. He was just like Dodo. Selina's breath caught as she looked closer, taking in every detail, the fur that seemed to shimmer under the moonlight, the calm, alert gaze fixed directly on her. It was so much like him that, for a moment, she felt her heart swell with a hope she had buried. Barefoot and still in her nightclothes, she made her way outside, moving slowly down the steps toward the gate. The dog sat perfectly still, watching her with that same gentle patience she remembered, and as she stepped closer, he lifted his head, his eyes filled with an almost knowing expression. She paused a few feet away, hesitant, yet compelled to come closer. He was looking at her like he'd known her forever, like he'd been waiting just for her. The dog's tail began to move, a slow, rhythmic wag, as if he recognized her, welcoming her with the warmth and loyalty that had once been Dodo's alone. Selina felt an unexpected warmth rise in her chest, and despite herself, a smile crept onto her face. She moved a little closer, feeling an old, familiar happiness beginning to creep in. Maybe, just maybe, Dodo had somehow found his way back to her. But as she reached out a hand, memories came flooding back, and reality sank in. She had seen Dodo fall. She had felt the cold finality of that day, and she had taken him to the graveyard herself. Her hand faltered, hanging in the air as she looked at this dog before her, her heart filling with both joy and sorrow. He looked so much like Dodo, but how could he be? As Selina stared at the golden retriever, her heart ached with a confusing mix of sorrow and hope. But then, just as she was lost in that moment, she noticed something strange. His eyes. They weren't the warm, gentle eyes of a loyal dog. These eyes glinted in the dim light, catching a strange, almost unnatural reflection, like the gaze of a wolf. They were sharp, cold, and wild, holding none of the familiar warmth Dodo's eyes once did. A chill swept over her as she took a step back, the hairs on her arms rising. This wasn't Dodo, she realized. This was something else, something she didn't understand. Her steps grew hurried as she moved back toward her house, her pulse quickening. Just as she reached the gate and fumbled with the lock, she heard a howl behind her, loud and low, piercing the quiet night. It was no ordinary howl. It was almost as if a wolf, not a dog, were calling out into the night. A warning, a reminder of something lurking nearby. Selina rushed inside, shutting the door behind her and bolting it. She tried to catch her breath as she leaned against the door, her mind racing. Whatever it was, it hadn't followed her, yet the feeling it left was unmistakably unsettling. She quietly moved to another room where the window overlooked the road. Cautiously, she lifted the curtain to peer out. The night was still, but as she looked closer, she spotted something that froze her in place. Two glowing eyes in the distance, a soft, haunting light, almost hidden among the trees, watching her house. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the curtain, feeling that piercing gaze reach across the distance, filling her with an unfamiliar fear. Then, in a moment, the eyes vanished, and from the depths of the forest, she heard a howl echo through the silence, a sound that left no doubt in her mind that this creature wasn't just a dog. It was something far beyond that. As she stood there, memories of Dodo flooded her mind, filling the empty, eerie quiet of the room. She thought of how he used to greet her at the door every evening, his tail wagging wildly, his eyes lighting up with joy at her return. She remembered the countless nights he would curl up beside her, resting his head on her lap as she read, or simply watched the world go by. Every moment with him was a reminder of their special bond, a silent companionship that had filled her life with warmth and love. But then, her memories shifted. She recalled the strange look Dodo had given her that night in the garden, the distant, unrecognizable stare that had left her unnerved. There had been times, brief but undeniable, when his eyes had glinted with that same wildness, a hint of something foreign and frightening. She had ignored it, chalking it up to her imagination. But now, those strange moments took on new meaning. Could it have been this creature, this shapeshifter, that had somehow found a way to Dodo, to her home? Selina stood in the silent room, her heart heavy as the realization set in. Whatever had visited her tonight, whatever had worn Dodo's familiar face, wasn't him. Her beloved Dodo was gone, and in his place, something else had come. Something that wore the faces of loved ones, but held nothing of their souls. She closed the curtain, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she turned away from the window. Outside, the wind carried a soft, lingering howl from the forest, a haunting reminder of the creature that had stolen her Dodo. Selina knew she would always remember her faithful friend, the playful, loyal companion who had given her years of joy. But she also knew that a part of her would forever be haunted by the memory of those wild, wolf-like eyes staring back at her from the face she had once known so well.